Welcome back, everyone, to another week of online programming from the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. I'm Executive Director Dakota Russell, and this week we want to talk a little bit about the legacy of incarceration, about some of the good things and the bad things that it has left behind and carried on throughout the generations. And I thought a great place for us to get started is by talking about the origins of ourselves, the origins of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. The strength of our foundation has always been our ability to bring together a broad coalition of people who either have connections to the site or who care very, very deeply about it. But it's always been a diverse group that has always been built into our DNA and continues to this day. And it's one of the reasons that we've been able to last as long as we have. So today I want to talk to you about a few of the groups that have influenced the foundation and made it what it is today. The one thing I unfortunately do not have time to do, and am not going to venture into, is naming everybody who deserves enormous credit for getting this foundation started and off the grounds. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of people that we could go through. And I hesitate to do it because I don't want to forget anybody at all. And so I'm going to keep things broad today, but I encourage you, if you see someone in the slideshow here, or if you know of someone who was involved in the early days, go ahead and give them a mention down in the comments. Let's recognize them for the hard work they've put forth. I just don't have time to do them all in the program today. But I do want to get us started with a story. And that's the story of this little White House right here. This White House is actually believed to be a part of the camp. If you come here, you've kind of seen it sitting on the hill up above the interpretive center there, sort of nearby the hospital buildings. Originally, it was, part of it, only part of it survives today, but we believe it's a partial remnant of what was married staff housing. So the white staff had a little ring of buildings up on top of the hill here where the married members of the staff would live, mostly teachers. But before that even, this building is believed to have been part of the CCC camp up at Deaver. It was one of the buildings that the government actually recycled to use in the camp. But by the 1980s, this building had become the extension building for the Heart Mountain neighborhood. And so it was sort of a meeting place for all sorts of different clubs and groups. And among them was a quilting group composed of ladies from around the neighborhood, many of them who had long histories in the Heart Mountain area. And as they would quilt, they would look out the window across the highway here. And sitting across the highway, you can barely make it out over there, is the honor roll. And the honor roll was really one of the last surviving pieces of the camp, in addition to the hospital buildings over here, that was still around in the 1980s. And what these ladies noticed as they continued their quilting was that more and more numbers over the years of Japanese Americans started driving up to look at the honor roll and to look around and to try and get their bearings as to where the camp had been. Most of the buildings had been gone for many, many years. The government sold off all the buildings of the camp right after it closed. And so for the most part, there wasn't anything left of the residential area, but this honor roll was still there, and they would return to it. What the ladies sitting in this building did not realize was that what they were witnessing was part of a larger national trend that had been going on. In 1969, a group of Japanese Americans, some of them former incarcerees of the Nisei generation, but a lot of them of the Sansei generation that had been born just after camp, started having a desire to go back and revisit these sites, most of which had fallen into disrepair or were barely there by the late 60s. And this really started at Manzanar. This is what you see pictured here, the camp out in California. And the first organized pilgrimage happens there in 1969, where a huge group of former incarcerees and their descendants come to the area, work on cleaning up the monument a little bit, and sort of take some time to reflect back on this history that had affected so many of their families there. And in both formal capacities and informal, one family, two family trips, over the course of time, these pilgrimages became more and more common. And so that's what was beginning to happen in Wyoming in the late 70s and the early 80s there. And it was noticed by the locals, mostly because they too had connections to this history. When the government had sold off all of those barracks, many of their families had bought them. The barracks were cheap. They were sold off at $1 a piece, and they were a great deal for incoming homesteaders. Heart Mountain is really interesting is that almost as soon as the camp closed, the government opened up the area for homesteading. This was largely able to happen because the Japanese Americans before them had irrigated the land and had prepared it for farming. But homesteaders started coming in the late 1940s there, and they started rebuilding their own homesteads with pieces of the camp there. And so they felt personally connected, not just in the sense that they were living on the same land, but in the sense that a lot of times they were living in the same buildings. They knew how damp and cold the barracks could be in bad weather. And they felt a certain kinship toward these Japanese Americans who had been forced here. And so they started to think to themselves about how they could help to preserve this story. And so a more organized movement started to form to really welcome the Japanese Americans when they arrived here and make sure that there was something to see from the camp. That took the form of leading informal tours, but it also took the form of building memorials out there. And so throughout the 80s, several of these homesteader families started to build up around the honor roll area. First, they kind of fixed it up and replaced some of the rock work there. But then they started to add additional memorials and signage that explained, for instance, what people were looking at when they looked out into the fields where all of the barracks used to be. And so by the end of the 1980s, they really had developed a place that was much more welcoming to the pilgrims that were returning there. Simultaneous to all of this was happening the Redress Movement. And this had been going on throughout the 1980s as well. Largely because of these pilgrimages and largely because of the involvement of the Sansei generation that were convincing their parents that it was time to speak up and it was time to get this injustice fixed. There had been a huge movement to get, for the first time, an apology from the government and some sort of redress for the incarceration, which had never really, either of them, been provided over the years since the camps closed. And so all of this, after many, many hours of testimony, after much activism on the part of the Japanese American community, resulted in the Civil Liberties Act being signed by Ronald Reagan in 1988, which allowed for every former incarceree, if they were still living, to receive $20,000 toward redress, and to receive for the first time an apology from the government. And so this was a major milestone in recognizing that this had happened during World War II and that it was wrong. And so from there started to be a larger interest growing out, both locally here in Wyoming and nationally, in recognizing this history. It started here locally with a group here in Powell that had started to form to collect some of the artifacts from the camp there. At first, these were pieces that had stayed here in Wyoming, that either incarcerees had given to the local people or things that had been left behind after the incarcerees left or had been bought up in government auctions that had been held over the years. And so at first they started to collect these pieces in a building that the bank in Powell owned. And then when they outgrew their space there, eventually moved to a storage building where they continued to collect these pieces, really working just entirely off of volunteer support. It was all about the passion of the local community here. And this is that storage area that you're seeing right in there. Another thing that was happening in the early 90s, though, uh, was that there was a strong interest in preserving some of the barracks of Heart Mountain that were still out there. As I said, all of these have been moved off of the site, but many of them were still standing. Even to this day, there are barracks all around here in the Bighorn Basin, some of them that people still live in, that have been remodeled and fixed up over the years. But there were several barracks that had been relatively untouched since the 1940s. And there was an interest in preserving these somehow, but not at this point preserving them in Wyoming. The first thing that happened was an effort to take some of these barracks down and move them back to California. The Japanese American National Museum was actually looking to procure a Heart Mountain barrack and wound up with a couple of them to preserve there and to tell the story of the camps. And so a crew of volunteers, mostly former incarcerees and their descendants, once again, wound up coming up to Wyoming and dismantling several barracks, numbering them as they took them down, and rebuilding them out in Los Angeles in the parking lot of the museum there. And in fact, if you go to the Japanese American National Museum today, in their main exhibit on incarceration, there's still a piece of a Heart Mountain barrack that actually has been reassembled inside of the building there. But this drew the attention of a lot of locals, and it became the first time that the local community started heavily interacting on a more formal basis with the Japanese American community. And sort of a germ of an idea started to form within these different groups. The homesteader group, the group in Powell that was collecting the artifacts, and the group that had come in to preserve these buildings here. The idea that maybe they could build something bigger out of this. Another key component to this was a series of symposiums that were started to talk about the history of this camp at Northwest College that brought some of the real movers and shakers from back in the camp's time up to talk about their stories and to tell the story about how the camp had affected the local community, but also the stories of the hospital, of the newspaper, of some of the things that people on the outside hadn't necessarily recognized going on within the camp. And so all of this spurred a lot of talk. And in the mid-90s, for the first time in 1994, and then officially in 1996, several of these people from these different groups started to get together and talk about forming a single foundation with the idea to do something big, with the idea to preserve this history in a way that would not just be there for the present, but that would live on throughout generations. And this was where the idea of the Heart Mountain, Wyoming Foundation was born. Now, the first project that this newly formed foundation took on was the restoration of the honor roll that I mentioned before. This, in the 1940s, had listed all of the names of the men who had gone off to serve in the military from the camp, both incarcerated people and people on the white staff there. And by the 1990s, this had largely faded to the point where you couldn't even see the names anymore. And so the early foundation started a project working with the Bureau of Reclamation to preserve this original existing honor roll, but also to replace it then with a brand new replica of it, and to gather up all of the names that would have been on it. So a group of volunteers actually went talking to folks around the Japanese American community, went down through the Heart Mountain Sentinel, the camp's newspaper, and other related sources to find as best they could the names of every man and woman who had served from Heart Mountain and to build a replica of this honor roll that would honor them. They completed that project in 2003, and almost immediately after that, started on building an interpretive trail off nearby it that would actually point out some of the small remaining features that were still around the camp and would tell the story of the camp over the course of 10 stations there. That was completed in 2005. But through all this time, the foundation had bigger dreams still. They wanted to construct a museum at the site, someplace that would hold all of the collections that the people in Powell had been collecting, and also some of the collections that had returned to California with the former incarcerees that they now wanted to find a permanent home for. And so, even though they faced huge adversity here, and even though public opinion was against them, a lot of people said, you know, you can't build a museum out in the middle of nowhere. Who's going to come out? Who's going to come and visit it? The foundation members believed that this could be a success. And so even from 1999, they were starting to plan out initial ideas of what the building could look like. And in the early 2000s, they purchased 50 acres in order to put an interpretive center on. Now, it took a while to finish that project. Pretty much from 1999, when they first conceived of it, up until 2011, they were in active fundraising and planning mode. And the project went through several different iterations. But in 2011, they did what everybody said could not be done. And they placed Heart Mountain Interpretive Center on the site of the former camp there. This picture is from the grand opening. You can see that in lieu of cutting a ribbon there, they're cutting a strand of barbed wire, which I think is pretty symbolic there. The Interpretive Center opened to the public in 2011 with thousands of people returning back to the site to witness it. It had really been a grassroots movement, in addition to pulling in some major donors to fund the building of the center. It had pulled in many families that were involved in this one way or another, either local here in Wyoming or scattered across the nation, really. And had truly been a grassroots effort in a lot of ways. And so it was a huge event for people to finally see a permanent piece of history that was occupying the landscape where the camp once was. For them, it was the knowledge that this wasn't going to be forgotten now, that this would always have a home here. And so it was important to know that this history would never be erased from the landscape. The foundation continues along those same ideals today. We now have an 18-member board that leads the foundation, as well as several members of our advisory council, many of you whom you see pictured in this photograph from last year's pilgrimage. Every year, we hold a pilgrimage around the same time as the anniversary of the grand opening there in July. And it generally brings several hundred people out to it. To return to this place, many of them coming back for the first time ever, many of them descendants of the former incarcerees who are coming back here for the first time to experience this and to try and understand their family history better. And many of them still locals from around the community that have grown to love this place and feel a connection to it through their connection to the land here in Wyoming. And our board still represents that. Of those 18 members that I mentioned, we still take a concentrated effort to make sure that's composed not just of people whose families were incarcerated here at the camp, but of locals who understand that this is part of Wyoming's history too, and that we've got to embrace this as a shared story that we're all in together. And so that's really been the genesis of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, you know, growing and evolving through time, but also keeping a remembrance that it is that diversity, it is that coalition building that makes us strong. We're looking forward to talking more with you about some of the additional legacies of incarceration later on. You know, today I feel like was a happy story, but we're also going to revisit some of the trauma that has been extended on through the years and decades that's left over from this camp experience. And we're going to talk in a little more detail about the redress movement, which is a huge piece of this history that has to be told. So I encourage you to keep tuning in throughout the rest of this week because we've got a lot of great programming for you. Thanks again for supporting the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation.